Daniel Mercer had always believed that the most important things in life were the ones you protected by saying nothing. He'd built his printing company, Mercer Press, from a second-hand Heidelberg press in a rented garage in 1987, hauling paper reams himself until his back ached and his hands bled from paper cuts that never quite healed before the next batch arrived. He'd miss school plays and birthday dinners and the slow, unremarkable Saturdays that turn out, only in hindsight, to be the ones children remember forever. He'd told himself it was temporary. Then he'd told himself it was necessary. Then he stopped telling himself anything at all, because by the time his daughter Claire was 12, the silence between them had become its own kind of language, one neither of them had chosen, but both of them had learned to speak fluently. Claire was 31 now, and Daniel was sitting in an oncologist's office on a Tuesday afternoon in March, listening to a man he'd met exactly twice explain what stage 2 lymphoma meant for a 67-year-old who'd ignored a swollen lymph node in his neck for 4 months because he assumed it was stress. "Treatable," Dr. Anand said, leaning forward with the careful kindness of someone who has delivered this sentence many hundreds of times. "The prognosis is genuinely good, Mr. Mercer, but we need to move quickly." Daniel nodded. He asked 3 precise, practical questions about timelines and treatment protocols and side effects. He thanked the doctor. He drove home in complete silence with the radio off and sat in his driveway for 22 minutes, watching a sparrow investigate the gutter above his garage door. Then he went inside and made himself a cup of tea and did not call Claire. He had sold Mercer Press 11 months earlier, in April of the previous year. The sale had come from an acquisition offer by a regional print conglomerate called Harwick Holdings, a company so aggressively corporate that they had a logo consisting entirely of 3 blue rectangles overlapping at precise angles. They had approached Daniel through a broker in January, and by April, after weeks of negotiations that Daniel had conducted himself because spending money on a lawyer felt like admitting the whole thing was real, the deal had closed at $5.2 million. $5,200,000. After taxes and the broker's commission and the severance packages Daniel had insisted on for his 11 employees, packages the Harwick people had initially tried to reduce, and then stopped arguing about when they realized Daniel would walk away from the table entirely rather than leave Gary Pulaski, his press operator of 22 years, without a proper landing. Daniel had walked away with roughly $3.4 million. He hadn't told Claire. He hadn't told anyone, really. His accountant knew by necessity, his attorney at the end, but Claire didn't know. His neighbor Frank didn't know. The men he played cards with every other Thursday at the Elks Lodge didn't know. Daniel had deposited the money, moved it into a mix of conservative investments that his financial advisor, a cautious woman named Patricia who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and never seemed to sleep, had arranged, and then continued his life with a precision that bordered on deliberate theater. He still drove his 2014 Subaru Outback. He still ate lunch at the same Greek diner on 5th Street, ordering the same chicken souvlaki plate. He still wore the same canvas work jacket he'd had since 2009. The reason he hadn't told Claire was something he'd examined from many angles over the past 11 months without ever arriving at a clean answer. Part of it was privacy. Daniel had always been private the way some men are religious, as a foundational orientation rather than a specific practice. Part of it was the fear, irrational and persistent, that the money would change something between them before he understood what that something was. But mostly, if he was honest in the way that a Tuesday afternoon diagnosis tends to make a person honest, it was because telling Claire about the money would have required also telling Claire about the years, about the choices, about all the Saturdays he hadn't been present for, converted now into currency and sitting in a brokerage account under his Social Security number. It felt, in ways he couldn't quite articulate, like proof of a crime. The chemotherapy started in April. Daniel arranged his treatment schedule around Claire's visiting habits the way he had once arranged his work schedule around everything else, with an engineer's precision and a father's cowardice. Claire came to visit once a month, usually on a Sunday, usually for 4 or 5 hours. She would bring food she'd cooked in her apartment across town. She was a good cook, better than her mother had been, which was saying something. And they would eat at the kitchen table and talk about her work, which was project management for a mid-sized architecture firm, and about books, which was the one subject they had always managed easily and carefully around the perimeter of everything else. He scheduled his infusions on Thursdays. He wore collar shirts and blazers on Sundays when she visited, which hid the port. He bought a good hat, a deep charcoal wool fedora from a shop downtown, which he wore when the hair loss began in June, and which Claire, on her July visit, said made him look like a retired detective. "You like it?" he asked. "I love it," she said. "You should have been wearing hats your whole life." He almost told her then. The words were right there, organized and ready like type set in a composing stick. "Claire, I'm sick. Claire, I sold the company. Claire, there are things I should have said 20 years ago that I'm only now finding the grammar for." But she was smiling at him with her mother's eyes. Ruth had been gone 8 years, a cardiac event on a Wednesday evening that had given them no warning and no preparation. And Daniel had looked at that smile and lost his nerve so completely that the moment passed before he could find it again. "More coffee," he said instead. It was Gary Pulaski who told her. This was not Gary's intention. Gary was a decent man, not a meddler. He had worked the Heidelberg press at Mercer Press for 22 years, and when Daniel sold the company, Gary had used his severance to buy a small boat and start a modest charter fishing operation on Lake Erie, which suited him in the way that certain retirements suit men who have spent decades doing skilled physical work and miss it less than they expected. Gary ran into Claire at a gas station on a Saturday in September. Claire was filling her tank. Gary was buying coffee. They knew each other in the loose, peripheral way that a boss's daughter knows the people who work for her father, names and faces attached to occasions. Christmas parties and the one company picnic in 1999 that Daniel had organized, and then stood apart from for most of the afternoon, grilling hot dogs with his back half-turned to the crowd. "Claire Mercer," Gary said, genuinely pleased. "How's your dad doing? Tell him Gary says hello. Tell him I've got 3 bookings next weekend and I blame him entirely." Claire smiled. "I'll tell him. How are things?" "Good, good. You know the sale hit us all hard at first, but honestly," Gary paused, reading something in Claire's expression that made him stop mid-sentence. A stillness, a very particular quality of attention. "The timing was good," he finished more carefully, "for all of us." "The sale," Claire said. The words were not a question. They were a repetition, the kind a person makes when they are buying themselves 2 seconds to understand what they've just heard. Gary Pulaski, to his credit, recognized immediately what had happened. He saw it in the way Claire's hand had stopped moving on the gas pump handle. He saw it in the small vertical line that appeared between her eyebrows, the same line, he thought, that Daniel Mercer got when something had gone wrong on press and he was calculating the damage. The family resemblance was strong in that moment, and it was not a comfortable thing to witness. "I should let you go," Gary said. "He sold the company," Claire said, "not to Gary exactly, more to the middle distance between them." "When?" Gary told her, gently, quickly, that he'd said too much, that she should talk to her father, that he was sorry if he'd. "It's not your fault," Claire said. She said it firmly, which was how Daniel had always said things that required firmness and not volume. "It's fine, Gary, truly." She drove to her father's house. Daniel was in the backyard when she arrived, in the low amber light of a Saturday afternoon in September, sitting in one of the wooden Adirondack chairs he'd had since the 90s, reading. He was wearing the charcoal hat. He saw her come around the corner of the house, and he saw from the particular quality of her stillness. She had stopped walking when she spotted him, just for a moment, just a half second, that she knew something. Parents learn to read their children's faces the way pressmen learn to read paper, not by thinking about it, but by having looked at it long enough that the knowledge becomes physical. He closed his book. "I ran into Gary Pulaski," Claire said. "Ah," said Daniel. She sat down in the other Adirondack chair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. A neighbor's lawn mower ran somewhere in the middle distance. $5 million, Claire said. 5.2, Daniel said, before taxes. She looked at him. She was not crying and she was not angry, which was somehow harder to read than either. She was doing what he had always done, assembling information before responding, building the complete picture before speaking. He had passed this quality along to her without realizing it, the way you pass along a jaw shape or a tendency toward stubbornness. "Why didn't you tell me?" Daniel took off the hat and held it in both hands, turning it slowly. He had prepared for this conversation in a vague, theoretical way for 11 months. He had not prepared for it to happen today, in September in the backyard, with the lawn mower going next door. "I wasn't sure what it meant," he said. "What it meant?" "What it meant for," he stopped. "Your mother and I built that company. She did the books for the first 9 years, you know that. After she died, finishing out those last years felt like, I don't know, it felt like keeping a promise. And when it was over, when I sold it, I didn't know what I was supposed to feel. I thought I'd feel lighter. I felt like I'd been erased." He turned the hat in his hands. "I didn't want to tell you about the money until I understood what the money was. And then time went by, and it became harder to explain why I'd waited and," he paused. "Claire, there's something else." She had been watching him with her mother's eyes. She didn't move. "I've been having some treatments," he said. "Since April. Chemotherapy. Lymphoma stage 2, which is the good kind if there is a good kind, and the doctor seems to genuinely believe there is. The numbers have been moving in the right direction. I have 2 more infusions and then we reassess." The lawn mower next door stopped. The silence was sudden and complete. "Since April," Claire said. "Yes. It's September, Dad." "I know. You've been doing chemotherapy since April and you," she stopped. She pressed her fingers against her lips briefly, collecting herself with the discipline he recognized as his own, reflected back at him. "Why?" And here was the question he had been circling for 6 months, in hospital waiting rooms and quiet evenings, and the long insomnia of 3 a.m.s that chemotherapy had introduced into his life like an uninvited houseguest. "Because I didn't want you to be afraid," he said, "and because," he looked at his hands, at the hat, at the years of paper cuts and press runs and loaded silence between them. "Because I've spent so much of your life being someone who wasn't present, Claire. Physically present sometimes, but not really there. And I thought that if you had to spend months being afraid for me, driving me to appointments, rearranging your life around my illness, you would look back on this time and it would be another thing I'd taken from you. Another thing I'd made about myself." "Dad," her voice broke slightly on the single syllable. "I know it doesn't make sense. I know that what I thought I was doing and what I was actually doing are different things. I've been sitting in a lot of rooms this year with a lot of time to think, and I know." He finally looked at her directly. "I was protecting myself, too. From having to be vulnerable in front of you, from having to let you take care of me. I don't know how to be taken care of. I never learned." Claire stood up and crossed the small space between the 2 Adirondack chairs and sat down on the arm of his chair. She did not hug him immediately. She sat beside him for a moment first, the way you sit beside someone who has handed you a very heavy thing and you're deciding how to hold it. Then she put her arm around his shoulders. He was thinner than he used to be. She noticed that now. "The hat," she said softly. "The hat," he confirmed. "I should have known." She rested her head briefly against his temple. "I should have looked harder." "I'm good at hiding things," he said. "You're good at looking, it's not your fault." "The money," she said, "what do you want to do with it?" "That's what I want to talk to you about. I have a financial advisor, Patricia. She's excellent, very sensible, and I've been thinking about," he hesitated. "I'd like to set up something, for you, not to give you a lump sum, nothing like that. But something that could, if you ever want to start something of your own, or buy a house, or I keep thinking about your mother, about how she did the books for 9 years before we could afford to pay her fairly for it, and I think she would have wanted something to be passed forward." Claire was quiet for a moment. "You are the most complicated, simple man I've ever known," she finally said. Something in his chest eased. It was not a resolution, he understood that. There were still years to account for, still long silences to learn how to fill. The treatments weren't finished. The conversations they needed to have had barely begun. But she was here. Her arm was around his shoulders. The September light was doing something generous to the backyard, and somewhere in the neighbor's yard, a bird he couldn't identify was making a sound that was almost unreasonably cheerful given everything. "2 more infusions," he said. "I'll drive you," Claire said. It was not a question. Daniel Mercer, who had spent 40 years believing that the most important things were the ones you protected with silence, looked at his daughter and understood, for the first time with his whole body rather than just his mind, that he had been protecting the wrong things entirely. "Okay," he said. Just that, one word, small as a first payment on a very old debt. "Okay." The next Thursday, Claire sat in the infusion center waiting room with a paperback novel and 2 cups of coffee from the Greek diner on 5th Street. She read 17 pages. She barely absorbed a word. She looked up every time the door opened, and when her father finally came through it at noon, moving carefully, the charcoal hat at a slight angle, looking tired in the way that was becoming familiar, she stood up and handed him his coffee and didn't say anything at all. Sometimes silence is the right language. Just not always, not anymore.